You have recently won an award for your fiction, for your book, The Secret She Keeps. This sort of came at a time too where you just had bypass surgery and your doctor told you he was surprised that you hadn't had a heart attack. That's an incredible amount of luck in very different areas. I wonder, did you feel that too?
I felt very lucky over the fact that with no symptoms at all, my GP had insisted I take a stress test and then, a CT scan and then an angiogram, which revealed, sort of massive problems, one artery 100% blocked, one 98% blocked, and one 46% blocked. So I felt incredibly fortunate that was discovered, because my first symptom was going to be when I died.
Keeled over.
When I just keeled over. When it comes to winning the award, I felt very fortunate. It was sort of my 5th time, I think, of being up for that award. Less luck involved in that, I like to think.
You were born in Casino. I think your dad was the local school teacher. I wonder, was it a no-brainer that the son of a teacher, an English teacher, I think, becomes a writer?
I don't know if it was a no-brainer. I think I had a tremendous advantage that I was surrounded by, when I say surrounded by books, and the family was quite poor. Mum had 4 kids in 4 years and Dad was the sole breadwinner. So we couldn't afford to buy books, but we were consistently, the library was sort of the place that we went to every week. And so that passion for reading was inspired early. And also my father, I think, if he could have had his life over again, would have loved to have been a writer.
How do you know?
Well, when he retired after more than 40 years of teaching. He's finished up being a high school headmaster, and he retired at 60, and we bought him the desk and we bought him the computer because he wanted to write. And in the end, I think he played patience on the computer, and he just couldn't. He wrote the family history, but apart from that, I don't know what happened. He just felt he just got stuck.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about your dad later, but I heard that when you were at school at one stage, you stole an exercise book from a stationery cupboard. What was that about? Was that Great Things in Mind? Or?
I think there is nothing more beautiful than a blank white page. And my little Catholic school in Gundagai, St Stanislaus Catholic school in Gundagai, had a stationery cupboard at the back, and each year you'd be given the little exercise books for each subject. But I would sneak in and steal a book or two. And the aim was I would always look at that page, think I'm going to write something. I'm talking I'm probably only 6, 7, 8 years old. I'm going to write something important. And of course, the moment you write your name and begin writing on that page and make your first mistake, you've messed it all up.
So you were actually quite a tearaway, weren't you? Didn't you set fire to someone's property?
Look, my childhood was very sort of Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, fishing at the fishing hole and swimming at the swimming hole sort of childhood. And I was let to sort of run free around the hills around Gundagai, which were dotted with gold mines, and always warned not to go anywhere near these mines. Several times almost fell down shafts and the like. But one particular day, I must have been about 6, I took a box of matches up into the back paddock behind our house, intending to light a little campfire. And there'd only been about 7 years of drought. And that fire turned into a raging grass fire. And having raised and the first house that it threatened belonged to the head of the Gundagai Rural Fire Brigade. And I ran and raised the alarm and crawled way up under the house amongst the redback spiders, listening to the sirens, and there were 15 brigades that were called in from around the district to bring it under control. Thankfully, no houses were lost. There were a lot of fences and a few barns and other things. And I'll never forget my father putting his head through the little trapdoor saying, "Come out and take your punishment like a man."
Wow.
And I said, "I'm not a man, I'm just a boy."
I wonder whether the American author that you once wrote to ever got wind of that. You wrote to Ray Bradbury because you vastly admired his works. And, you know, I think we've all done that at some stage of our lives. I can't tell you how many times I haven't received a reply. But incredibly, you did get a reply, didn't you?
I came home from primary school to find a package on the kitchen bench, and it was contained the 3 or 4 books that weren't available in Australia, and a letter from Ray Bradbury himself, saying how thrilled he was to have this young reader on the far side of the world, which is an astonishingly generous thing to do, you know. And I think, you know, it's very easy to say that's the reason, you know, but it's certainly one of the reasons that I wanted to be a writer.
I wonder, do you think about that when you get fan mail?
I do, and I reply to particularly children or young people writing to me, or people, because one of my main characters, Joe O'Loughlin, suffers from Parkinson's, and so I get a lot of correspondence and emails and letters from sufferers and carers, and I will always spend a lot of time responding to those. It's funny, I've told that story, the Ray Bradbury story, a few times, and received messages from people sort of saying, "Can we please have free books?" And which I don't encourage, you know, since my children do have to wear shoes next year.
I know you got a place at Sydney University, I think to study law, but you decided to study journalism, and eventually you went to the UK, I think in the mid-1990s, and you worked on a whole load of really fascinating cases. Was there one case that you would sort of say was the thing that turned you into a writer as opposed to a journalist?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because I think all of those sort of, the big stories I covered informed my later writing. I guess the greatest story that I could never write was when I was the first Western journalist into the Moscow State Archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the archives were crumbling and the roof was leaking, and these priceless sort of papers that went all the way back to Peter the Great were crumbling. And they were looking for, you know, money anywhere they could find it. And so I was allowed in, and among the files that I got to see were Stalin's Hitler files. A cleaner had stumbled across a box, it was in 1991, which shouldn't have actually been in that library, it should have been in the KGB archives. And at the end of the Second World War, when the Russians were first into Berlin, and Stalin refused to believe that his great enemy could have committed suicide, that Hitler could have, he just refused to believe that Hitler was dead. And so he had arrested and brought back to Moscow 9 of Hitler's closest sort of aides, his personal physician, his driver, and they were imprisoned for close to a decade in Lubyanka, in the prison in Moscow, and they were interrogated daily, and the resulting files are probably the greatest collection in terms of the day-to-day life of Hitler. I mean, what he was like, what he ate, the women he slept with, the women that he demanded be brought to him, the body doubles he used, a bit like Saddam Hussein. I mean, the most astonishing sort of stories, you know, by the time they collated all this material. And I was involved, I was working for a newspaper group in the UK, and we made a very substantial offer, because there were also pieces of the bloodstained sofa that Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide on. The sofa was broken down and wrapped up still with the bloodstains and photographs of it complete.
Wow.
But we were outbid by the new Jewish Holocaust Museum in Israel, who I think for all the right reasons wanted to make sure certain materials didn't fall into certain hands, and they gained access. So I had this, for a journalist, I mean, the greatest story of my career there. And there were great stories in that archive, but I could never write it.
Oh, How devastating. One of the stories you did write, which was about, I think, a British missionary who was a pedophile. And the story ran in, I think it was the Mail on Sunday. He sued, and incredibly, he won.
He was a guy called Joe Homan. He ran something called the Joe Homan Trust, which had set up boys' homes in India and Sri Lanka. And these were for street urchins, boys who were homeless or whose families just couldn't afford to keep them. And he raised millions of pounds through the sort of from Europe and from the UK through this charity. He would come back regularly for fundraising. He was on the verge of being honoured by the Queen when we revealed that these boys' homes, he was basically a pedophile who'd been kicked out of the, excommunicated by the Catholic Church when he was a brother working with children, and he had been caught interfering with them. So he'd gone to India. And he had abused countless numbers of boys. And we exposed him, he sued, and it subsequently led to about a 5-week defamation trial in London. And the judge could not have done any more than hold up a big sign to the jury saying, "This man deserves not a penny." And yet, the jury, it was an odd decision. The jury found in his favour, but only awarded him damages of, from memory, about £17,000. And we imagined that we were going to lose millions. If we lost this case, if he proved that he in fact was this saintly charity worker who had saved the lives of hundreds and hundreds of boys who we had smeared and called a pedophile, he would have won £1 million plus.
So it was an odd kind of victory. I wonder, what did it do to you? It's the reason I quit journalism. When I went to India to do that first story, I promised a lot of people who, this is the poorest part of India, Tamil Nadu, I mean, in the south, and they were so poor. And we couldn't pay them, or we couldn't even offer them security, because that would have been seen as payment for what they're giving us. So we couldn't protect them. And I thought, in my naivety, that I could protect these. If they told the truth would protect them, and that we would stop this man. And I was wrong. And I remember when that jury came down with its verdict, I collapsed outside the courtroom on the steps. I mean, one of the victims that came and gave evidence was scarred down his cheek because this man had chewed his cheek open while he sodomized this boy. That's what sort of monster he was. And the idea that he went back to doing what he was doing, and I just, yeah. You become a journalist to try to do the right thing, and when you realise that I'd actually made their lives worse, I really struggle with that. How did you heal yourself after that?
I think it took a long while. I mean, as I said, my love of journalism died that day, and I guess I then went on, became a ghostwriter and a novelist, and it took a long while. I mean, today is here. It's one of the first times I've spoken about this in a long while. I still have all the files at home, and I periodically think I'm going to write something, and I feel sick to my stomach every time I think of it.
So, in the ghostwriting, you were helping other people tell their stories. I think there were 15 autobiographies at the time. Your name didn't go on the book.
No.
You were kind of like a psychologist to these people, weren't you?
I think to be a good ghostwriter, you have to be part psychologist, part sort of therapist. I mean, if you do it well, because I would often spend 7 weeks, like the longest I ever spent was 7 weeks living with the subject.
Living in their homes.
In their home. I was with Jerry Halliwell, Ginger Spice. My first ever showbiz one. I'd avoided doing showbiz ones because I thought that show business people wouldn't tell the truth. It was all about image management, but she proved me wrong. But you ultimately, you become, you know, incredibly close. They tell you things they've never told another human being, even someone that they've known in their entire lives. Because, I mean, the message I have to give them is, listen, if there's a skeleton somewhere rattling in that closet, you've got to tell me. And, like, we'll try to put the best possible spin on it, but if you don't reveal it, and this book comes out, and that skeleton, you know, is exposed, then the entire book is going to be discredited on the basis of what you haven't mentioned. And that doesn't mean that people don't have deeply private things that shouldn't be for public, you know, consumption. It's a very unique relationship, and it does mean, you know, you do get the tearful 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls from them, you know, when they're feeling fragile. And these are often very famous people.
Well, so let me ask you about a trickier character that I think you worked with in terms of your ghostwriting, and that was Rolf Harris.
The one I don't mention normally.
I wonder, when you were having those deep conversations with Rolf Harris, did you feel at the time you were getting the full measure of his character?
Rolf was an odd one. I only can talk, I know this in hindsight because I obviously know what's happened and what's come out. When I was working with Rolf, it was well before any of these charges had been laid or allegations had been made about, you know, his behaviour with, you know, underage girls and, you know, or groping women. But the thing that struck me during the process, he was so bleak and so dark. He, you know, it was like getting any sort of one. I mean, he's a man that had obviously worked on TV with people like, you know, Peter Sellers and Tony Hancock and Sid James and the Carry On crew, and I was looking for all these wonderful anecdotes of what it was like to you know, work on early days of, you know, TV in Britain, and it was like getting blood from a stone. And he, in fact, seemed depressed, you know, and I actually thought at the end that he was this manic depressive, a bit like Tony Hancock. It's that Tears of a Clown scenario with often some very, very funny people.
Yeah, they can be performers, but when they're not being performers,
Yes.
They're depressive.
And so I thought Rolf was one of those, and so that maybe should have alerted me. But the other thing was that Bindi, his daughter, was nowhere to be seen and refused to cooperate and talk to me for the book. And so I knew there'd been a falling out between he and his daughter. And I think in the penultimate chapter, Rolf, I mean, you know, what Rolf said to me when I said, what next, you know, what now? And he said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making things up to my wife and daughter. Now, I took that to meaning that, you know, he'd spent 40 years touring, spending about 3 or 4 months a year in Australia, that he was now going to devote his life to actually spending more time with them. I know now that looking at the time frame of when we were working on that book and when it became clear to his daughter and his wife what sort of allegations were going to come out, that they corresponded. And so the reason Bindi wasn't being involved is because, you know, she knew that one of her school friends were going to make allegations, or had told her about what allegedly, or it's not allegedly anymore, he was convicted, what Rolf had done.
During this time when you'd been working with fascinating characters and doing really well, I think most of the books ended up at the top of the bestseller list. Had you dreamt of writing, had you already written your own novel by this stage and just not shown anyone? I
did have in my bottom drawer the great, what still, you know, certainly I regard as the greatest ever unpublished Australian novel, is in my bottom drawer. It was almost published by Penguin about 25 years ago. It came down to a final publishing meeting. I missed it by a single vote around the table. And they said to me afterwards, if you had set that story, it was set in a small Australian fishing town, if you'd set that story in England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, we would have published it in a heartbeat.
Your first novel that was published, The Suspect, which was about this psychologist that we've been talking about, Joe O'Loughlin, there was an incredible bidding war. People were trying to clamber on top of each other to get it. I mean, for an author, particularly an author who wasn't known at the time, that must have been a huge boost to the old ego.
It was terrifying. It's sort of, I love telling the story about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were back living in Australia at that point, and the phone ringing and saying there are 5 American publishers bidding and 4 German publishers bidding, and the French have offered this and the Italians have offered this, and in the space of 3 hours, every dream I'd ever had of being a full-time writer came true. And by 7:30, my wife and I were still awake, staring at the ceiling, by which time we'd spent the money. And by 8 o'clock, we'd cast the Hollywood film. And by 8:30, that's when the terror set in. Because I thought, I have never finished a novel. I didn't even know it was a crime novel.
So you hadn't finished it by then?
No, it was 117 pages. It was a part manuscript of probably a quarter of the book is all they'd seen. And I couldn't tell them how it ended because I never plot my books out. And so they just bought it on that little snapshot. So buying a house, having seen a photograph of the front of it and not bothering to look inside.
So the first book is published. We are now many, many books down the track. Is there a particular boost when someone says, for example, the Germans say we want to make a TV show about this character, or someone options your books to make a film? I mean, in a writing sense, does that elevate you?
No, I actually have the opposite view. In Germany, they've made 5 films now out of the Joe O'Loughlin books, and 2 more are planned. And there's an Australian TV series planned for The Secret She Keeps. But I take this attitude as the book is the book, and it doesn't matter. People could make a brilliant TV series or TV show out of it, or a movie, or it might be awful, but they cannot take the book away from me. The book will always be the book.
That's a great attitude. With your latest book, The Other Wife, your character, Joe O'Loughlin, is faced with a crime that's actually happened to his father, who is lying in a coma, and he discovers all sorts of things about his father that he didn't know. And I wonder, part of that, I remember he said about his father that his father had been somewhat remote. I wonder, what about your relationship with your father? Was there any similarity between the guy in the coma in your book and your old man?
Yes and no. I mean, I guess there was a remoteness when it came down to my relationship with him, particularly later in life. I think Dad, particularly after he retired, and it goes back to what I mentioned about him wanting to be a writer, he became quite depressed. And I only discovered after he died that he was on antidepressants. And he was also one of those guys, and again, someone in his generation, I never forget, when I got my HSC results and got into law at Sydney University, being so excited and coming up and saying, Dad, I got, and he looked at me, looked up from the paper and said, that's nice, and looked back down at the paper. And I know he bragged to his mates on the golf course about the fact that I was, writing and that I'd done this book or that book, but he would never say it to me. Okay, he would never, yeah, and I think that's the thing that I struggle with. I spent my entire life trying to impress him for that moment when he would say, and I know when he died, I remember I was devastated when he died, and I remember thinking, who am I doing this for? What do I write the next book for? Because each book I'd written it had been to send to him in the hope that, he would turn around and say, I'm so proud of you, that's, I love this book or whatever. But it was just one of those strange generational things that you don't praise your children, So when my people have said to my mother, hasn't Michael done well? And her reaction is, all my children have done well, which I love. It's such a brilliant response, but that's very much the generation that my parents were in.
What about your own daughters, who you would probably say what your mum says about them? They're all doing really well, but does that sort of make you feel, I'm not of my dad's generation? I think most people of my generation think that. I mean, we're, as dads, we were far more hands-on, in terms of everything from changing. I mean, I do all the cooking in our house and have been married 30 years and have been the cook in the house for 30 years, and from when we had children doing their meals as well as
our meals. I mean, it's a different sort of, we're a different generation to my parents' generation, obviously. And I think with my daughters, I mean, they're all, you know, I'd be the first to say, they're all incredibly special, you know, and they all have completely, they're so different. It doesn't matter whether you raise them completely the same way, they turn out to be so different.
You have a lot of really heavy material that you have to deal with as a writer. I wonder, in general, are you a good sleeper?
Not, it's funny, I envy my very good friend Val McDermott, the Scottish crime writer, always says that when she leaves her writing room every day, she closes the door and the characters stay in there all night and they're there when she gets there in the morning. And I think maybe because I don't plot my books in advance, when I reach a point in the writing where one of my characters that I've grown to love is in great danger or you know, is anxious, I mean, I mirror that, and they haunt me and they won't let me sleep. And it's you know, I joke, but it's quite true that you know even when I wrote the most recent novel, The Secret She Keeps, the one before The Other Wife, you know, I'd be out to dinner with my wife and she would see my eyes glaze over and she'd kick me under the table and go, "You're with her, aren't you?" You know, because they consume you. And I think Vivian often said to me that she likes it when I finish a book because she feels as though she gets me back.
Well, thank you for being with me for the last half hour. I've enjoyed it immensely. Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane.
That was the author Michael Robotham. You can watch episodes on iView or our website. You can contact me on Twitter and Facebook. I'll be back here next time. See you then.